Participants were eagerly okay. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Scientia Science Writing Internship program for fall 2024. Today's guest is our Sir Ehsan Masood. Thank you, Sir Ehsan Masood, for taking out time and joining us. Welcome to Scientia.
It's really great to be here. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, so I would briefly talk about Sir Hassan Masood's background. Then I have very exciting questions for him. I've been personally looking forward to this session, and Sir Hassan Masood is a veteran in science writing. He has more than 25 years, between 25 to 30 years experience in science writing for different platforms. I've already shared his background with you. Presently, he is with Nature Science. Nature is a global leader in science writing and science editorials. And Sir Ehsan Masood is the bureau chief of nations for Middle East, Africa, and Asia. He has been managing this position for quite a while. His writings and books have been published within the science writing, and he has been lecturing, teaching, and pioneering the area of science writing for quite a while. And he has also taught science writing courses at Imperial College in London. And over to you, Sir Ehsan Masood. Thankfully, you are here. And firstly, my question would be, I would like for since most of our audience is from the South Asia and Global South, that's why we wanted to connect with you. It is very important for us from this perspective. I would like you to tell us about your background, how you reached here, and what were your experiences. Please share with us.
Well, thank you so much. It's nice to meet you all. I've been in science journalism or science communication for too long now. Probably more. I'd say more than 30 years or around 30 years. My first degree, I have a university qualifications in science. My first degree is in physics, and then after my undergraduate in physics, I did a postgraduate course in science communication, and then from there, I've been working in different publications, mostly for the one that I'm in now, Nature, the journal, but also other publications. I guess my own journey is a little unusual, partly because of the field of science communication, especially in the UK, which is where I was born and where I've spent most of my life, was really only developed after around the time that I was graduating and coming in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So it's there have been or publications like newspapers and television and other media. They've always had specialist staff, like science editors, who are the people responsible for the science output. They've always had them. But it was really only after the mid 1990s when this started to increase and the opportunities began to increase. And they increased mainly because, or at least principally because of a report. The report's called Public Understanding of Science, and it was published jointly by different scientific organizations where scientists themselves were concerned that one of their concerns was that the government of the time was not paying enough attention to science, particularly in funding. And which is why they recommended that there should be more people and there should be more opportunities for science communication. It would make science more visible. And because of that visibility, the policymakers would then take more of an interest in it, and they would protect it, they would promote it. and so on. So that connection between science communication and policy has always been there for a long time. And in that specific UK context, it was one of the reasons why this field started to grow at that time. And I was in my 20s at the time, and this is what I wanted to do. And so in a sense, I took advantage of that. In terms of my interests, so I'm probably in a minority among science writers. Science writers who, when they when they become part of this work and this profession, everyone has their interests and their specialism. So in a way, you could say that everybody is in a bit of a minority. Some people will like to write about neuroscience. Some people write particle physics. Some people might write about genomics. So my interest has almost always been in policy, in the relationship between science and funding, science and politics, science and religion, science and society. So these have been my the things that I'm always interested in: science and its applications, and of course, and its internal structure. So policy is like sort of one way of. It's not the only way, but it's one way of looking at it. And I've always had an interest in science in the global south, and especially science policy in the global south. So over the years in my working life, I've either lived or been a correspondent in global south countries, in South Asia, including in Pakistan, of course. I was based out in Islamabad for some years, in Cairo, in Egypt, in parts of the Gulf countries, also in can't remember now where else, but yeah. So I've been very fortunate that I've been a reporter or a correspondent or an editor in lots of global south countries. So that's a little bit of hopefully gives you a bit of a flavor.
Well, quite a journey. I mean, today the thing is that because there is a quite very difference in terms of equity. We have seen in the global south and north, how the events and things are being happening. The difference of science. So importantly, I would come to a question, since your most of the experience have been in uh, covering global south, but also seeing perspectives from being sitting in London. So why do you think that what is the key difference on the global south and the north? Why science writing and the pursuit of science is more important for global south? How do you see this?
I mean, we could divide that into two, really. I mean, so for a long time now, well, at least certainly, since what you might call the colonial times or the Industrial Revolution, or however you might put it,
Yes.
the countries that are in the global north, not all the countries, but certainly, the United States, the countries that are in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is like they're the club of all the high-income countries. And particularly since the end of the Second World War, these countries have really pulled away in, but both in their funding and in their organization of science. And the job of the science communicator then follows that, where you're in an environment where there's a lot of funding and there's a lot of promotion and there's a lot of just a lot of activity. So however you measure the activity, whether you measure it through publications, like in journals, numbers of journals, or articles in journals, if you measure scientific activity through patenting, applied science, intellectual property, if you measure it through funding, through how much money is going in, the richer nations spend something like somewhere between 2 and 4% of their national income, of their national wealth, as measured through something called gross domestic product, or GDP. So this is how much they spend. Even very small countries like, countries with very low populations, they, in the global north, they will be spending something in the order of 3%, maybe 4%. of their wealth. Whereas the global South countries, and the interesting thing is that even the wealthier global South countries, like the countries of the Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates, for example, the members of that consortium, other ones, they don't spend that level, anywhere near that level. They're rising. And I would include China. China has had a massive transformation in my own professional lifetime. In the mid 1990s, when I first came into this business, I think I would need to check this myself, but China was spending in the region of 1% or maybe a little more of its national wealth, of its national income on science, and now it is. It's definitely caught up on many measures. It's in absolute terms, it's now either close to or the same as the United States, particularly in many lots of different fields in publishing and in funding. Its trend is higher. So there's been it's taken China a while, but China's in that group. The other countries, there's a sort of leader and then a kind of, if you like, follower situation. So now China is very much in another league. The other global South countries, the more middle income countries, and I would include in that India as well. I would include Brazil. They've been pretty much stuck, in that sort of region of 1%, 1 to 1.5% area. And then there's a very large group of countries that are at 1 or below 1%. And that situation hasn't really changed. So a lot of it does come down to money, not entirely just the quantum of money, which is important, but the money in relation to how rich a country is. So as long as a country is spending a very large amount of money, even if it isn't very, very rich, it will mean that it will be doing better in science. And of course, that has an impact on the community of science writers, because if there's a lot of science happening in a country, then usually it means there are websites, audio, video, magazines. There's in a sense a little bit of there's a business model in science communication itself. Just to finish the thought, really, most of my own experience has been in publications which are read by scientists, and that includes mainly journals, but other. So this is the sort of more specialized world, and that's really where I've spent most of my experience. So there's lots of, but when you have a large community of scientists, they need to be able to talk to each other, they need to be able to publish, they need to know the news about science that's happening, just like any other profession, like lawyers or bankers or accountants and so on. So that creates demand. So when you've got a big active science community, that creates demand for science writing, for science communication. When you have less, then there is less. It doesn't mean it's less important or that there shouldn't be one, but in terms of employment, it means that there are more opportunities in that space. Sorry, long answer, but I hope it helps.
Yes. Quite in terms of economics and numbers, we can objectively make the key difference in terms of how much they are investing. And since you pointed out the rise of China, you also pointed out in the terms of scientific terms as well, how it is very observable. And okay, so I think since you ended up your question toward the community of scientists, so since most of the, since your background is also with belongs to physics and science, academically. And academically speaking, most of our participants also would like to learn about while being a scientist, why is it important to communicate science and to push the policy, to write about science? Why is it important for scientists to reach non-scientific people with non-scientific backgrounds as well, and how to communicate what they are doing?
It's a very big question. I'm only going to take a little bit of it, but we can always come back to it in the Q&A. So I'm just going to make really one or two main points. So I guess you're asking me about the importance of, if I could put it that way, the importance of communication for scientists. I mean, there are really many reasons, why this is For me, and this is a very much a personal view, I don't. This is not necessarily a kind of a view that represents nature or even my other employees. I think it's my own. I think I would say that one of the most important, if not the most important, reason why we communicate science is really because all of us, we are all citizens of the societies in which we live in, and science communication is, to me at least, and is an extension. It's a part of our education. We are educated. Whatever we do in life, at whatever level we of education that we have, some of us will be starting work, with just some years of schooling. Some people will have many degrees. Some people might not even have formal schooling, as I've experienced it, or as I suspect all of you have experienced it. And so, to my mind, science communication is just a part of the education and the awareness that is, I would say, is part and parcel of mainstream education. Now, what do I really mean? I mean, there's also a definition question. What do I mean by science communication? So here there are different people will define it differently. Some people will say that it's really about knowing about all the advances in knowledge and discovery and invention. The world of scholarly knowledge is really moving so fast in the life sciences, in the physical sciences. Publications like ours and others, we're always, every day we're publishing new discoveries, and of course the knowledge of that and the conveying of the knowledge of that, of course, is one way of science communication. Another way, I think, to my knowledge, which I think speaks to your question more, is that science is also a way of thinking.
Yes.
It's yes, of course, it's the product, it's the output, but it's also the process, and it's about finding out about the world, using certain, if you like, certain models or certain tools, really understanding that evidence is very important, asking questions is very important, testing something is important, replication, making sure that if you found out the result of a question or something, then other people have found the same answer as well. So these sort of elements, which are so important, if you like, they're the rules, the framework of how science is done. That is as important in science as, of course, is the final discovery. I would say it may well be more important. And so science communication really then is, overall, to my mind, is the communication of a particular way of thinking. And yes, it does result in, lots of really exciting and honestly quite mind-blowing discoveries. But it's also a way of knowing that the information that we are being given, it's a way of being confident that the information that we're acquiring is true, is verifiable as much as is possible, is accurate, is authentic. And so it's both those things. It's the knowledge and it's the process of acquiring that knowledge and being confident that the knowledge we have, because as is so often said in our science when we learn it, however we learn it, is that science is also potentially, or the end result of science is very much is the latest piece of knowledge before something else may come and supersede that. And we see this in so many fields. A lot of fields it happens less because we're getting closer and closer to what we might consider to be the most accurate understanding of a particular scientific phenomenon. In other fields, it may be different. And what we're learning now is very much the latest in that in a particular line of thinking, but what may come might change that. And so it's very important to be as aware of the process of how science is done as much as the final output.
Well, another question would be out of from you need to answer from your experience, and since you mentioned about the credibility, how important, and how, what are the ways how can a science writer and communicator can build their credibility with time?
Um, I think I mean there's many ways in doing that. I mean, I think if we're starting out, um, then often what I often recommend is that when you're starting out, then write about the things that you know a lot about already, because that will build your credibility. If you are a biologist, or if you are a physicist or a chemist or an economist, or whichever field that you might be in, but focusing initially, not always, but initially on your field, and really understanding it from first principles, and then being able to convey that, I think is a good start. I would also say that within the field that you're writing about, definitely focus on new things that are happening, because that's what a lot of readers, we know from now that we have access to analytical tools so much better than we did in the past. We know that readers really like to know what's new, what's different, what's changed, what's amazing, what's big, what's small, what's wide, what's narrow. So those kinds of things are always as important. And I think the third thing I would say is to focus on sources which are credible. And so when we're conveying the news about a particular discovery or an invention, then to make sure, because we all do have in a sense, a responsibility as much as we can to be as accurate as we possibly can, is to make sure that our sources are credible sources. Now, what do I mean by that? So these could be studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. These could be studies that are published in what are called preprints. So preprints are, they're like sort of scientific studies or papers that are in progress. And what a scientist has done is they've done some experiments. They might have found a result. It's still in progress. It's still being checked, or it's still being read or verified or what have you. But they really want to get the news out. And so they will publish in different what are called preprints. And there's life sciences, physical science, social sciences. They all have their own equivalents. And that's becoming a much bigger source for science news. So there, in that case, then it's very important for the science writer or the science journalist to then speak to other researchers. If you're writing something from a preprint, speak to other researchers. What do they think? Try and understand where does the findings sit in the spectrum of knowledge, and to be able to give readers a more rounded view is quite important. So that's another element. I mean, at the end of the day, what do we mean when we're saying that we want to be credible? What we're really saying is that we want our readers and our public to know that the information they're being presented with is, as much as possible, is accurate, is reliable. I think it's really important now because the technology has allowed so much, or basically anyone, literally anybody with one of these, can be a science writer or a science communicator, can be a publisher. All these things were different jobs, and they were more specialized jobs. That has changed, and it means then that not everyone is aware of the rules and the conventions of the specialized jobs that used to exist, and so there are huge challenges to credibility.
Yes, quite a very comprehensive and very effectively we discussed. Okay, one more thing. Since we are talking about, we talked about credibility. One more important thing, since you have been a policy writer and you have pushed on many things, what are happening, the events I've seen through your writing, and we have shared your profile with our readers as participants as well. How do you think, as a science writer, you could push policy? And number two, how effectively you can be as a science writer if you are pushing some policy, you are finding out changes, you are suggesting solutions. So what are the example? Could you highlight one or two example how pushing policy as a science writer worked for you and how effectively you did it?
So the short answer is that, to my knowledge, to my mind at least, the science writer, it shouldn't be our job to. So all of us in life, we have our different roles, and the policymaker has a role. They are chosen by their people, by their governments, to be able to. It's a very the job of a science policymaker is extremely varied. They could be working in a funding agency, a department that distributes funding for scientists. They might be working in a regulatory agency, like an environmental protection agency. They might be working in public health. I mean, we saw in COVID how everybody in government suddenly had to become, almost overnight, had to become much more aware and much more conscious of science. How it's done, how it is published, its the limitations in different science communication formats, and so on. And so the world of science policy has always been quite wide. And since the pandemic, I would say there's a huge amount more awareness about science in policy than before. And my characterization of policy is basically in two ways. There's what I would call policy for science, which is all the decisions that are made by public and other organizations regarding scientists. It's about the money that science gets, that universities get. It's about the rules for science publishing. It's about the rules for intellectual property, and it's really very much the policy around the scientific community or the enterprise. And then there's another branch of policy which is called policy for science. Science for policy. So science for policy is when you look at the totality of the policy world. If you look in your countries, there is a Ministry of the Interior, there is a Department for Foreign Affairs, there will be a Department for Environment, there'll be a Ministry of Science, there'll be a Ministry for Energy and Climate Change. So all across the work of the government, the work is divided into all these different departments and ministries, and pretty much all of them will be having something to do with science. Even the Department or the Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, even these ministries, if you dig a little deeper, they will be having something to do with science. They might be employing, the very minimum, they'll be employing scientists. They'll be reading the results of research. They'll be doing lots of other things. And so policy has really become, science has always been quite close to the world of policy. So this is not, in a sense, it's not a new phenomenon. And then if you go really back into history and you start to look at science in much earlier times, it's always been the same. That relationship between science and the policy world has always been strong. I think for the science writer, I would say that it's for someone that does my kind of job, and many of you on this call, I'm hoping as well, is that it's important to understand that we have different roles. So my role is not to actually make the decisions. That isn't my job. That's the job of the person in the government or in the parliament or in somewhere else. They are and they need to make their decisions. They need good information and accurate information. And so if I have a role in policy, it is to always be mindful that my role is to provide information and make sure that it is truly, as much as possible, accurate and authentic and reliable and credible. But my job isn't to be the decision maker. That's where I stop. And that's where the person in policy, whether they're a civil servant or a parliamentarian or an actual minister in the government, that is their role, to actually be the decision maker in that. And I think that's sort of one thing that I would say. Now, there are exceptions, of course, because there are science communicators who work in policy roles. And one of the best examples that all of you will know is those people who work in university communications, the press office, the media office of a university. Their job is to promote and to get a wider readership or a wider audience for the science that's being published in their institutions. So that's a science communication role that's a little bit closer to policy. It's very close to what I would do, but their audience in a way, and the reason why they're doing it is a different audience. And there are also communications roles in government. There will be science writers working in the Ministry of Interior, working in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and as we saw in the pandemic, there are a huge amount of communications roles in public health policy. So that's another way where science communicators can use their skills. So again, I would make the distinction. Now, because I'm employed in a independent publisher, science publishing, science news organization. So my role as a science writer is different. And I would say that I would stop. I'm not the decision maker. Yes, there are things that I can say, and there are things that I will write that will have an impact or an influence on decision makers. But I'm not the decision maker. Now, if you're a science communicator or a science writer employed by a government, employed by by a business, employed by a university, then we still share the same skills, but then your role is closer to the decision maker than mine is.
Well, yeah, that quite an overview in terms of how much it is spread within the public sector, within the universities. Everywhere is quite had a map of everything everywhere what people are doing, owing to the discussion and your answer. Importantly, I think people who are in leadership roles in science, those people are also the dual of two. They are also scientists and also the decision makers.
You're absolutely right. That's very true. They are that 100%. There are people, they might be university presidents or vice chancellors, and sometimes they also move into government. Sometimes it might be temporary. There might be caretaker roles in government. The technocrats, who come in between when there's a change in government, and they might come in. So yes, there is some overlap, and I think the scientist who is working, certainly to my mind, the scientist who's working in a big administrative role, they might be a head of a funding agency, for example, or they might be running a university. Then they are a scientist, but they are also a policymaker. So yes, there is overlap. Good point.
And one more thing you added about the pandemic thing, I could remember we could see that since the what you could say the boosting of the online world, the remote world, since our post-pandemic era, we are having webinars and talking to each other. Very people are able to reach the what we could do the spike we have in the remote world. Importantly, what I saw for every organization, for every even the smallest research groups, even smaller science organization, small in companies who are doing the research work, the companies who are doing the R&D departments of industry, they are employing people who are able to write and communicate, put out press releases, put out the work they are doing, the communication experts you pointed out. So this everyone needs a communicator, the person who could delve into the between role, the semi person who understand the science, who understand the general people. So this advent and this also has been spread and a whole new era of jobs.
You're so right. This is really true. There's been a big expansion, and I think the expansion is partly because of technology, because the corporate world has has had R&D departments probably ever since there's been a corporate world, but they didn't really have a need to be very public facing
Yes.
until until online technologies became the technologies that they are now. And because at the very minimum they need a social media presence, they obviously need a website presence, but it's much more than that now. And so yes, that there is this is absolutely, as you say, this is a growth area for employment, and we haven't even got into AI yet, but yes, that's true. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Mm.
It would be my last question, but it would be a little broader. But you knows the effect. Since there are global events happening as an observant, wars and political situations are there. So, how do you think these situations do present an uncertainty in the world of science, for scientists? How fundings and things are effective? How the global south is effective in terms of economics? My question is the pretty same. I've mentioned a lot of things, but how the things are affected due to the occurrence of these uncertain events?
It's a great question. It's also a big question. I feel like it's it's the question for its own session. I'm not going to be able to be comprehensive, but
Yes.
I'll say a few points really.
Yes.
So science has always there's always been an impact when there is conflict in science, and it's a big again, if you look through previous times, going back hundreds of years, maybe even longer, you'll see evidence of the relationship between science and technology and conflict. Scientists are scientists have been responsible, if I can put it that way, or people working in science and technology have been responsible for technologies that are used in warfare. That's just it's something that we've seen right from the earliest times, and we're seeing it right now in the present conflicts that are happening all over the world. The really tragic conflicts in Africa, in Europe, and in the Middle East right now. I think there's another role. There has always been another role for science. So there's the sort of the world of the science and warfare, but there's another role, and that is the work of the scientist in protecting people, in more recently preventing wars, and of course in public health. And you'll find hundreds, thousands of researchers working in all of these fields, in all of these areas. And there are, again, so many examples, both from deep history, from more recent history, right down to the present, how medicine, has been, advances in medicine have come about because of the experiences of wars. Now, they might be surgical techniques, they might be, methods to stop the spread of diseases. There might be, methods for diagnosing and treating illnesses, and so on. So a lot of this work comes out of the experience of wars. And the third thing that I will mention in terms of science and conflict is that since, to my knowledge, at least since the big wars of the 20th century, when the community of scientists has become quite large. I think we've said that there's always been science since probably the beginning of time. There's always been a form of science, but the role of the professional scientist and the quantity of professional scientists has just exploded in the world since the end of the last big world wars in the late 1940s. And since then, they've been big enough to organize into in their own communities. And there are scientists who organize around peace. And one particular organization I will mention, it's called Pugwash. It's named after a place in Canada, Pugwash. This was established after the first atomic bombs were dropped on Japan in the end of the second big world war in 1945. And the scientists who were developing the bombs, they were mostly European and American scientists. Of course, the leader of their effort was Robert Oppenheimer, who's now been the subject of a famous film. There were many, many more scientists, and I think a lot of them went through quite a crisis of conscience, having developed, as I was saying earlier, having developed a weapon, and it was very much a scientific effort. To then see that weapon being deployed, the work of their own minds, the work of their own hands being deployed in killing people and in causing so much death, but also its aftermath. We're very much still seeing the effects of that today. They established an organization which would be a place for scientists who want to work for peace. And that organization still exists, and it's called Pugwash. So there's three examples for you.
Well, yes, the examples have been quite very prominent since you mentioned about the bomb scenario in early in last century. Importantly, there are these two examples are quite similar or very individualized. For instance, when the bomb was being made, the scientists were traveling from countries to countries. Albert Einstein was trying to move over in the US. Most scientists were traveling toward the US. In today, we could see the ongoing situation in the Middle East, the universities being blatantly exploded. The things are happening, and we could see number of scientists. It has been mentioned all over the Twitter. There are more than 150, 200 scientists, people who have been who are very quite leader, known, even very known people who are within the Western and Eastern world, globally recognized people. People are the targets. The scientific community directly being exploited in the both scenarios. Quite the thing is that here, I think we were able to discuss very interesting questions. I really enjoyed the subject matter as well, uh, from the relatable part as well. We as science writers and the event things are going on, and we are observers and the storytellers, and the future historians. We are trying to document the things in any medium. I think now we could go toward the questions. We are free to take up the questions from audience. You can raise your hand. You can put up your question in the chat box. Uh, Sir Ehsan Masood will happily answer. So, any questions, guys? Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay, Zainab. Zainab's question is there. Could you get it, or I could repeat?
No, I'm just going to read it out. So Zainab asks, how can international bodies ensure equal access to scientific funding, particularly for developing countries like Pakistan? It's a really, really good question, Zainab. The short answer of it is that actually there isn't equal access. That's just, I think it's just a statement of what is happening. And, two ways of looking at it. So the low and middle income countries, Pakistan is in that group. They mostly, as I said at the very start, they don't devote anywhere near what they could be doing in terms of funding their universities and their other scientific bodies. And also equally important, one thing I didn't mention is that in a funding situation, it's almost an important rule that the governments that do the funding, then they stay out of the decision making of actually how that money is being spent, and they especially don't interfere at the level of the actual grant. They can sort of set the overall objectives, but they mustn't be sitting there with the peer review panels and interfering in that way, because then that's a very unhealthy mix. I mean, science and politics are very connected, as we've just been discussing, but at the level of funding, it's extremely important that everyone knows what their job is, and it's not the job of the decision maker to be present, along with the peer reviewers and so on. There are international funds which scientists from developing countries can apply for. I haven't done an analysis for a while, but if I were to guess, I would say that there hasn't been any great increase in what those funds are. Not any kind of sort of very, very big increase, but those funds do exist, and they're in broadly. I would put them in two categories. There's two types. There's international funds from the United Nations system. And these would be organizations like UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education and Science Agency. And they don't have a huge amount of funding, but they have some. They also have local and regional offices, which people can apply to. There's the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and there are many more. And so that's a source of funding for scientists. The other source, and it's a greater source, is the philanthropic organizations. These are the science fund organizations of science funding that have been established by people who become very, very wealthy from their businesses. And I can name some names. There are, from the previous, if you like, technological era, there is the Ford Foundation, which is the philanthropic funding agency established by Henry Ford, who is the creator of the company that still makes cars. There is the Rockefeller Foundation. This is another big American foundation established by somebody who is very involved in the early years of the oil industry, and his family. And you can go fast forward to now. The founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, has his own foundation. It's called the Earth Fund. They fund environmental projects. There is, you find a tech billionaire, and you will see a few steps next to them. There will be a funding agency, and they are, the amount of money that they allocate for scientific research projects is much more than what the United Nations system has, and they are increasingly a source for a lot of science funding, international scientific cooperation, and so on.
Well, quite a comprehensive overview we could have from your broader experience. And the last difference is you said the private sector is more effectively involved. So that is very good to know thing. Okay, so there are two more questions. If you could see within the comments.
Yes, of course. We got a question from Hira. Is it Hira or Hira?
Yes, it's Hira.
Hira. I have a question. How do you communicate complex scientific concepts to non-experts? I don't do it very well. So I'll just go back a little bit to when Foz was asking me about my own experience. So most of my experience in science communication has been in the world of science itself. So the journalism that I've been involved in, even to this day, right now, has been the readership of people like me is mostly scientists. I've done some work, mostly with the BBC, around communicating to non-experts, but I don't have a lot of experience. So I'm kind of not the best person to answer that question. But I will say one thing. Sorry about that. I will say one thing, and that is that it's much more difficult. If those of you who are entering into that world, I think your jobs are harder than my job, because we still try. We try, and when we're editing articles or writing articles, a rule of thumb is to say that, well, if an article is about molecular biology, can it be understood by a particle physicist? Or if an article is about astronomy, can it be understood by a theoretical ecologist? So is there enough Is there enough explanation in that way? And so it's still a challenge, but it assumes that the readers will know what is the scientific method. They will understand the sort of some of the nuts and bolts. We don't have to do explanation at that level. I think when you're going for complete non-experts, it's a whole other challenge. And I think, Foz, you've got some speakers coming up, or who are going to help you with that question more than me. But I'm going to very respectfully bottle out of this one. Because I'm not the best person who knows. Only to say that job is harder than my job.
Well, it is still from the editorial perspective. You mentioned a very important thing, and more importantly, while the title of our talk is exploring the world of science journalism, so then you explicitly also mentioned earlier to me as well, and also the purpose of this talk was to also, because science communicator getting toward a more intriguing and a more deeper part toward becoming a science writer that is devoted or restricted toward the science community as well. And also the second part you have mentioned, the rule of thumb is that it accessibility part, that it could be accessed through other niche of scientists, people who are from the different, but they could understand. So that really helped me.
No, thanks. Thank you, Hira. I know you've said thank you for the response. It's not really much of a response. So I think Foz, you've got some other speakers coming, who have experience working with the mass media, for example. I think they would be, if you put that question to them, Hira, you'd get a proper reply in terms of how do you do this. I wouldn't mind being on that call because I think I'll learn as well in the process. Khadija has a question.
Yes.
So it's about science and religion, and Khadija asks, what is the difference between the science and religion relationship in the global north and south? It's a brilliant question. And how can we use religion to get people more interested in science, especially where countries like Pakistan, where religion has a higher influence than science? There are really two questions, actually. There's more than two questions. So I'll just we'll take each one very briefly. So the first one is the difference between the science-religion relationship between global north and south. I probably couldn't characterize it specifically because there's so much variation. I mean, there's an assumption that in the global north, people are not religious, or they're less religious, or and the global south, people are more. I mean, it's just, again, I don't know how much validity there is to that statement, but there is certainly a perception in some places that, and I'm not sure, to be honest, if I don't know enough about whether that perception is actually the reality. I mean, if you just look at, the United States, they're going through an election campaign right now, and people who are very devout, the community of evangelicals, they're a very, very big part of the voting group. That each political party, there are two parties, the Democrats, the Republicans, they're both trying to appeal to different segments in the population, and the community of people who are very devout and who have very strong faith, is a very important part of that election. And that sometimes, I think it sort of it goes against the perception that somehow religion is less important. I mean, maybe it's less. Again, I'm probably not the right person, but maybe it's less important in European countries. But I think if you start to dig deeper, and I would definitely encourage you, there are researchers who study this question. There are journals in this space. There are journals in the space of religion and science. There are research departments where these questions are studied. And I think that's where I would take the second part of your question, which is, how can we use religion to get people more interested in science? Again, it's not for me to say. I should make that clear, whether we should or shouldn't. But I think as a question for science communicators, it's a really, really important, and I'm glad you asked. It's a very, very important question. That what exactly is there? Firstly, is there a role for religion? Number one, and secondly, if there is a role, then how effective might that be? I think to the first part of that question, some people might say there shouldn't be a role. People should be free to believe. In any society, they should be freedom to be able to be as you wish to be. Some people would like to be religious. Some people would like not be religious. And that's sort of one way of answering that question. Some people might say, actually, it's really important that because the future of humanity, lies in people being well educated and being just good citizens, then it's the role of of everyone to be able to further that aim. And of course, organizations that represent religion, faith groups, have had a very long interest in education. Religious organizations worldwide across all religions are deeply, deeply involved in education, in schools, in colleges, universities, both in so many ways. And so, again, as always, there's a kind of complexity of answers to that question. The final point that I'll say is that increasingly I'm seeing that there is an interest in seeing how can religion be or how can people of science or people in policy roles work with religious communities around things like climate change, because right now we're in a situation where the world is in a very serious serious environmental crisis. Some would say that we have a series of overlapping environmental crises, and one of the most severe, of course, is climate change, and the need for temperatures to remain within a certain boundary is almost likely we're on a trajectory to overshoot, to beat what are safe limits for temperature. And so people involved in climate policy are asking, well, how can we work with all communities, no matter where in the world, what religions or non-religions, in order to really get the message out that it's really important for all of us to be more aware, firstly, of climate change, to change our behavior, to be more environmentally good citizens where we can, and to be resilient for the coming shocks. And so there are projects underway, there are research projects, and there are other projects where communities of people who are religious are being asked, or they're being they're in a sense sort of partners in that endeavor. How can is there benefit in working with religious groups to be able to promote and further that message? There are different points of view on that. I can't say there's any sort of one view, but I know that it's a very active topic in the research world right now.
Well, that is quite a view how these things do affect the system within the global north and south in terms of people who are religious. Overall, I think this quite has been a journey. If there is any other question, any specific different question from what we discussed, you can still pop in. Otherwise, in the meantime, we are quite done with covering a lot of subjects within the limited time of scope. And Mr. Ehsan is accessible through his email. You could search him down. His books are available. You could reach him with your questions. Good enough. And
I'm just going to pop my email address.
Yes, I will share with them.
Yeah.
I will share with them.
All right. Yeah, please do. And yeah, I'm. If anyone has a question they'd like to follow up, please feel free to write to me. Again, I'm very sorry I was late. It's inexcusable, but I won't bore you with the reason. Yeah.
Well, quite it happened, and the purpose of having different people from different background, and this has been quite an effective one. Since I've been doing this as the fourth one. Having to know every diverse view comes in with different experiences, different background, inspirational stories. So thank you, Mr. Ehsan, for joining us. Thank you for your time and answering all the questions. I would share the recordings onward with our intern as well and with you as well. Thank you for joining us again.
No, thank you so much, and best of luck with your course. It sounds like it's an amazing course. Yes. I wish I was a young person again, and I'd be able to join.
We can always. I actually, being very frankly, I since our last conversation, I did share the whole idea since we discussed two or three at the further